President Trump proposed multiple times to abolish the income tax. And this is probably one of the fascinating ideas that any politician has thrown in the last 50 to 70 years. Because everybody who's watching this video is paying to a certain extent the income tax. Just imagine for a moment how much money you can save if the United States will actually abolish the income tax. So that led me to ask myself a couple of questions. First of all, how is that going to impact you directly? How much money can you realistically save if the United States tomorrow is going to abolish the income tax? And the second thing is that what is going to happen to the US economy? How will that impact the entire US economy? And is it even realistically possible? I'm not going to just tell you my opinion. What I will do in this video, I'm going to give you the numbers, I'm going to give you the facts, and you can make your own mind by the end of this video. So if you're ready, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and let's dive in. In order to understand how abolishing the income tax is going to impact the United States and specifically you have to understand how the tax system works in the United States. Now, the tax code is really huge and very complicated, and we cannot literally go on every single detail. What we'll take a look is how the income tax works. And the United States has a progressive tax system. So the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. If you're making $20,000 a year, you pay much less taxes than somebody who makes $500,000. And I don't mean the amount of taxes that you pay, but the percentage of taxes. Now, take a look at this chart or this graph. Any income that is made below $11,600 is taxed at around 10%. Most of the taxes do not come from the poor people who make less than $47,000 a year. The real difference comes if you make anything between $47,000 up to $100,000. Then taxes rise by about 22%. That's already a lot of money. Of course, those numbers are slightly different for people who are married because the government has a system to incentivize people to build families and get kids. Because one of the reasons that we have such a complicated tax system is for the government to incentivize people financially to take certain actions. So if you want people to build families, you want people to have kids, you want the population of your country to grow, then you will give to people tax incentives for them to get married and have kids. If you want people to stop smoking, you put a high tax on cigarettes. That's one of the reasons why there's so many high taxes pretty much on every single country around the globe on cigarettes and alcohol. Now we know the reason. If you make anything above $100,000 but less than $191,000, it's taxed at around 24%. And the highest tax that we have is 37% on income that is earned above $609,000. So the people who make over $1 million, for example, are paying astronomical amount of taxes. Like almost 40% of that income directly goes into the IRS and goes into the government. And that is basically how the income tax works in the United States. So let's take a very clear example. So if you're making $100,000, then you're paying $17,400 in federal income tax. Now, besides the federal taxes that we just talked about, the progressive system, we also have state taxes. So a state like New York or California has a much higher tax rate than a lot of other states. And then we have states that don't have income tax, such as Florida. So in Florida, you don't pay any income tax, but people in California pay a lot of income tax. So if you include that, that is around $5,000 to $9,000. We also have payroll tax. Now, a payroll tax is the kind of tax that the government is going to tax you in order to pay for your Social Security, in order to pay for your Medicare. Half of it is paid by the employer and the other half is paid by you, which is around 6.2%. Then there is Medicare tax of around 1.5%. So if you're making $100,000, you are going to save at least this much money. I'm not talking about the state tax because different states have different kind of state income tax, but at least you're saving $17,400. However, the real people who will benefit from abolishing the income tax are the people who are making much more in income tax. So if you're making $800,000, you're immediately saving at least $200,000. Yes, you're still going to pay a lot of state tax if you're living in a place like New York, but if you are living in Florida and you're making over $800,000, you're automatically saving a lot of money, but you still have to pay some taxes in form of payroll tax and Medicare tax. So the biggest beneficiary of abolishing the income tax are going to be the middle class, the people who are working at really good jobs and making really high income. I'm talking about the lawyers, I'm talking about doctors, I'm talking about engineers, I'm talking anybody who has a job and is getting paid a lot of money. And to illustrate that point, just simply look at this graph. Of course, the bottom 15 or 20% of the population does not really save that much because they're anyways making less than $30,000. If you're making less than $30,000, you're not going to save that much. That's just 10% of your income. But if you're somewhere in the top 10 or 20%, such as the people over here, people who are making over $200,000, I mean the 15% of the population, they will save a lot of money. They will save up to 40% of their income. Even the people who are here making anything between $150,000 to $200,000. So if you're making like less than $50,000 and you think that you're going to save a lot of money, unfortunately, this is not going to help you. I mean, it's going to help you to a certain extent to save that much money, but people who work in really good jobs in those states or these cities that are attracting so many talents will be the biggest beneficiary. But a more important question that I want to answer is that who funds the government of the United States? Because if you can answer that question, you can quickly realize how much impact that is going to have on the entire US economy. I mean, what kind of a real consequences will abolishing the income tax will have on the entire US economy? And by looking at this chart, you clearly realize everything. So for 2024, the US government made around $4.9 trillion, which is, to be honest, a lot of money. Not going to argue against that. But it's nothing compared to how much money the government is spending, which is almost $7 trillion. We're actually spending a lot more money than we are earning. And most of that income comes from the income tax. That is $2.4 trillion. So when we talk about the fact that we're abolishing the income tax, you have to understand that we're literally telling the government that we are going to cut your main source of revenue. We are going to cut half of your revenue. Because if the total source of revenue is $4.9 trillion and we get rid of $2.4 trillion, suddenly the government is down by almost 50%. That is a lot. Imagine you lose half of your income tomorrow. What will happen to your kind of lifestyle? And if you're actually living paycheck to paycheck, it makes sense to a certain extent. You might be able to survive. You might be able to downgrade your lifestyle to a certain extent. But that's just part of the problem. Because if you look at this chart, you see a much bigger problem. Because right now, the US government is running a huge deficit of $1.8 trillion. So if we actually get rid of this deficit is going to grow significantly much more, which is why paying income tax is the most important source of revenue for the government. The second biggest source is, of course, payroll tax. And who pays the payroll tax? Exactly. It's a form of income tax that everybody who is employed is going to pay. Part of it is paid by your employer, and the other half is paid by you. So it's somehow part of the income tax, but we don't call it income tax because if we call it income tax, then income tax is going to be too high. So why don't we just simply give it a slightly different name? Now, the question is that how does the government spend most of that money? Now, I don't want to go into the details of the government outlays, but I'm going to give you some basic expenditure of the government to be able, if it's even economically possible for the government to get rid of half of its revenue. The biggest source of spending for the government is, of course, Social Security. And this is something that is very difficult to touch. It's $1.5 trillion. That's a lot of money. And if you're wondering why do we pay $1.5 trillion, and that's because people have been working for years and they have been paying taxes in order to have some kind of a retirement. Yes, Social Security does not literally covers all of your expenses when you go and retire, but at least it covers some of your income. For some people or a lot of people, it covers half of their expenses. So if we actually abolish the income tax, then how are we supposed to pay the Social Security for people who've been paying taxes for the last 50, 60, 70 years, and now they have been retired, and now we tell them what? Listen, guys, we decided to abolish the income tax, so there is no money for you. So this is something that we cannot possibly touch. The second basic or the second largest expenditure for the government is the national defense at around $1.3 trillion. Now, that's a lot of money, and you might have heard a lower number somewhere in different sources, but $1.3 trillion includes everything. Remember, besides having the world's largest military that operates all across the globe, we have a lot of veterans. There are people who have already served in the military and now they are retired, and you have to pay them money because that's part of them being in the military for so many years. You can't simply tell them, listen guys, it's over, we're no longer gonna pay you. So that $1.3 trillion, maybe to a certain extent, you can lower that number. Another major expense is, of course, Medicare at around $874 billion. And of course, another expense is $1 trillion on the debt that the government pays. Everybody knows that the United States has the largest debt one can possibly imagine. And if you stop paying the service debt, if you stop paying part of that debt at least, then you're going to go bankrupt. That is something that the United States cannot possibly afford. So if you're thinking who funds the government, then it is actually the income tax. It's the people who are working on a 9-to-5 job, paying individual tax and payroll tax. Now, the question here is that where are the rich people? Why aren't rich people paying taxes? I don't see them on this graph. Why didn't you tell us how much rich people are actually paying in taxes? Well, maybe it is the people who are making $200,000, $500,000, $1 million. I mean, some doctors out there make like $800,000 a year. But guess what? These are not the true rich people. I mean, everybody knows that a doctor who makes like $600,000 or $700,000, yes, he's pretty rich. He is making a lot of money, but he's paying a lot of taxes. But the true rich people, I'm talking about people who makes $10 million, $100 million, $50 million. Some people make billions of dollars. How about those people? Well, the corporate tax in the United States is around, the income from the corporate tax is around $530 billion. That's a lot of money, but it's nothing compared to the income tax and the payroll tax. We are talking about the world's largest corporations such as Apple, Boeing, Microsoft. But the true rich people do not pay taxes. And you don't even see them here because they do not fund the government. The government is not being funded by the true rich people because the tax code is designed in such a way that a rich person has a way to avoid paying taxes. And I'm going to give you some examples for you to understand how is that even possible. So when you go to Forbes or when you hear the news that Elon Musk made $100 billion, Bill Gates made $20 billion, Jeff Bezos made I don't know how many billions of dollars. That money cannot be possibly taxed because the way they made their money is by buying stocks in the stock market or building companies, and they hold shares in those businesses. What happens to those businesses is that suddenly those businesses grow and their income grows as well. But you don't have to pay taxes if your shares go up in value. So if Tesla shares tomorrow go in value and Elon Musk is going to be richer by $50 billion, unless he sells those shares and makes a profit, he is not obligated to pay any kind of taxes. Do you see how genius that system is? So those billionaires are not going to sell those shares because they know that if they sell those shares, they will be paying taxes and they don't want to pay taxes. That is why they don't sell those shares. So you might ask yourself is that, well, what's the point of that wealth if I cannot possibly use it? Now, first of all, you don't need $100 billion to fund your lifestyle. Even the richest people in the world probably need like what, 10, 20, 50, $100 million. I mean, who spends more than $100 million on his personal life? It makes no sense, right? So the way billionaires avoid paying taxes is that a lot of the expenses are going to be part of the corporation. So if you have a company, instead of you going and buying a jet, your company is going to buy the jet and will write it down as an expense and will lower down taxes for the company. Yes, you will be using the jet, but you're not actually paying for it from your own pocket. The company is paying for it and it's a company's expense. Now, another way they can avoid paying taxes is that, let's say I have a lot of stocks in the stock market. So I have so much wealth. What I'm going to go is that I will go to the bank and then I'm going to tell the bank, listen, I have all of these stocks and you have all of this money. Why don't you take this money and loan it to me as a debt? So I'm going to buy a Ferrari using bank's money. So this is a debt. And I have to pay the bank every single month, let's say, I don't know, $10,000 because of this Ferrari. So I'm going to go to the bank and borrow money against my stocks in the stock market. I'm going to fund my Ferrari because my stocks are earning me in the stock market 10%, but the bank is giving me 5% because I'm not simply borrowing money, but I'm borrowing it against the stocks that I have in the stock market. Do you see how genius is that? all I have to do is the minimum payment to the bank. So if the government would say, how did you get that Ferrari? I can simply say, listen, I did not make any money. I did not make any income to buy this Ferrari. It's actually a debt. It does not belong to me. The bank can come tomorrow and can take this Ferrari out of me. But I know, the bank knows, and the government knows that it's simply a beautiful scheme that everybody has created to let rich people to buy anything they want against their assets and make this simply the minimum payment. So in the eyes of the government, I am poor, but I'm living the lavish lifestyle that I have right now. It's simply a system for them to avoid paying taxes. So if you ever think in your wildest imagination that rich people are going to pay taxes, you are mistaken. Every time they talk about raising taxes on the rich, they are talking about on the doctors, lawyers, engineers who literally work just like you on a 9-to-5 job and are barely making $600,000 or $700,000, and then 50% of that goes into taxes. Do you see how it works? The only tax that the rich people pay is the capital gain tax. So if I've purchased my stocks and my stocks went in value 10 times, 20 times over a long period of time, and now I want to sell some of it for some reason, I'm going to pay maximum 20% in taxes. But usually there are ways to lower that down to 15%, 12%, and even 10%. That is the only tax that I'm going to pay, which is capital gain tax. Now, we took a look at the progressive tax system where the highest tax bracket is over 37%, and then there are state taxes, and then there are payroll taxes, and then there are Medicare taxes. But that does not mean I'm going to pay all of those taxes if I'm actually selling my stocks. The only tax is the capital gain tax, which is usually around 15%. Do you see why when you take a look at this graph, you realize that suddenly rich people are not funding the government? It is you who is funding the government, the person who is paying income tax. And that is why income tax is so vital to the survival of the government overall. And that's why if you take a look at the expectations of the experts about the future budget of the United States, suddenly you realize that the revenue of the United States over the next 10 years up to 2035 is going to grow up to $8 trillion, which is a lot of money. But expenses are going to grow much more than that at around $10.7 trillion. So we're expected to spend much more than we're actually spending right now. That we are not going to make that much money in the future because we cannot possibly tax the average person more than the government is taxing it right now. So if we also get rid of the income tax, by 2035, the government is expected to get $4.4 trillion from the income tax. So if you reduce that, if you deduct that from the $8 trillion, that is going to be like $3.5 trillion. So the government is going to make $3.5 trillion, but will spend $10.7 trillion. That is a disaster. So if you're thinking what is going to happen to the US government if the government is going to decide to abolish the income tax, just take a look at these numbers and you quickly realize that it is literally going to end up in a disaster that nobody has ever seen. So that is the question. What happens if the income tax is abolished? Now, there are other factors to consider. First of all, yes, of course, the revenue of the government is going to be reduced by $2.4 trillion and will bring it down to $2.5 trillion. But wait a second, aren't we going to make a lot of money from tariffs? That's a good question. How much can we possibly realistically make from tariffs? Maximum that the government can make from tariffs is anything between $500 billion to $1 trillion, because we're going to tax the products that are going to come from foreign countries. And you have to understand that foreign countries will actually take the exact same measures against the United States, and the US companies that sell the iPhones, the Microsoft products, Amazon, and the rest of the world will significantly suffer, and they will have to raise prices maybe even within the United States. And when you're imposing tariffs on foreign goods, who do you think is going to suffer? Of course, you will pay that tax because that product is being brought to the United States and is being taxed, let's say, at 25%. So if we tax everything at 25%, yes, we might be able to raise $500 billion, $700 billion, maybe slightly more than that. But you have to understand another thing. When you're imposing a tariff on a foreign good and it comes to the United States, suddenly people will no longer stop buying it. Maybe not everybody, but a large portion of the population will stop buying that good, which means that that good will be imported to the United States less and less, and the income from tariffs is going to be reduced by the government. So maybe in the beginning, the government can actually make up to $1 trillion if it's going to impose tariffs on everything. But that is unrealistic in the long run. It might actually last for a year, 2, 3, but literally not more than 5 years, because those companies will diversify their investments and their sources of revenue, and the US government will no longer have that $1 trillion. So a few $100 billion is the most realistic scenario. The second thing is that the US deficit is going to grow substantially from $1.8 trillion to $4.2 trillion if we continue or keep the actual spending that we have right now. That is the second biggest implication of abolishing the income tax. Or maybe the US government will simply abolish the Social Security or will get rid of the defense system. That is, of course, unrealistic because the United States spends more on the military than any other country out there. So abandoning the military is not an option for the United States. And even if we consider the fact that we'll reduce the size of the military, yes, it's possible, but you're not going to get this number significantly lower, because around 50% of that money, or maybe even up to 60% of that money, is simply the salaries that are being paid to the veterans, the salaries of the military personnel, the salaries of the generals who command these armies. And maybe, yeah, you can actually reduce it by $200 billion, maybe best case scenario $300 billion, but I don't think that is possible, because the United States has to be able to keep producing the world's best, most advanced weapons in order to be the most powerful military in the world. Now, another major expense that the United States has is debt. Now, this is extremely risky and this is extremely important, because now the US is paying around $1 trillion in debt. And if the government is not going to keep paying its debts, what do you think happens to people who don't pay their debts, or at least the interest on their debts? One day they are going to default. So if we rip off the government of $2.4 trillion, what do you think is going to happen to these debts? Of course, the government won't be able to pay that, because the government will be left with what? $2.5 trillion, best case scenario $3 trillion. Half of it is going to go to Social Security and the other half is going to go to the military. So the government won't be able even to pay the interest on the debt that it has. And these are some of the consequences of abolishing the income tax. So if you ever think that abolishing the income tax is possible, then forget about it, because it is going to eliminate and decimate the entire US government, and the government won't be able to pay its debts. At least I'm not even talking about maintaining the world's largest military, but most importantly, the people who paid so much in taxes for the last many decades in order to make sure that they will have a good pension at the end of the day when they are going to retire. So the only way to save yourself no matter what happens is to make sure that you're not making your money from the income tax. You're not one of those people who are actually funding the government by paying a lot of income tax, but you change the way you make your money and you become one of the rich people. Instead of paying income tax, worst case scenario, you will pay capital gain tax because you're investing in the stock market and your wealth grows every single day, no matter what happens, and you're not being taxed. Why? Because they're not selling your investment. Why? Because you have made some great investment. And how do you make those investments? That is something you should start teaching yourself if you want to actually change the way you make your money and shift from being the middle class and the poor to being actually rich. And if you need help with that, make sure to check the first link in the description. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.